Good morning. We will be continuing our discussion on traditions in world cinema, and today's topic is Italian neo-realism. So, we know that there are other traditions in world cinema such as the French New Wave, we have been talking about the German Expressionism and the British New Wave, several others. During the course of this discussion, we will also sometime later talk about the Iranian New Wave cinema, the Latin American cinema. So, we are now, the attempt is here now to look at the major cinematic movements. So, we talk about Italian Neo-Realism today. But before I talk Neo-Realism, we should be able to understand what is realism after all. So, what is realism? Now, see, realism again, like other, we are using the cinematic terminology here, cinematic vocabulary here, but it all goes back to literary terminology. So, realism finds its roots in the writings of French writers such as Honoré de Balzac, Gustave Flaubert, the guy who wrote Madame Bovary, and Émile Zola, who was also associated with the great naturalistic tradition. Now, historically, we are at the point where artists reacted against the romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th century. I am giving you a brief historical background. So, there was something called the romantic movement, and realism was a sort of response to that. Now, realism after all depicts the everyday life, particularly the everyday life of the middle and the lower class as they exist day to day, as opposed to the exotic, the romantic, the ideal as was depicted during the romantic period. So, every day becomes worthy of high art. Now, it also led to a certain degree of interest in the documentation of real life. So, realism focused on depiction of characters and places and also situations as they actually appear in life, not perfect, not completely flawed, but a natural combination of the two. Now, see, prior to realism, the norm was to make characters less like real people and more like symbolic characters, the hero, the villain, the damsel in distress, all these archetypes. In cinema, realism is a stylistic choice and can be understood as an illusion that what is shown on a screen is actually connected to reality. Now, realism is a contested term. What is real? People say Satyajit Ray's cinema is highly realistic. People may also question that how realistic is that kind of cinema. So, realism is a contested and a much debated term, that is are all things which we can recognize, are they real, are all recognizable things real. It is a mix of devices to disguise the fact what we really see in real life. Now, with the development of photography and camera was able to capture an objective truth about the world. Realistic films present what appears on the screen as natural. Now, one of the very first film of this period was one of the very first film actually, I am sorry to use the term one of the very first film, but the first film ever was something called arrival of a train at railway station, at the station, and also workers leaving the Lumiere factory in 1895 by the French film pioneers, the Lumiere brothers, and it was so real, okay, as close to reality as life. So, I would highly recommend that all of you watch these two films, the arrival of the train at the station and also workers leaving the Lumiere factory. the very first films ever made in 1895 by Lumiere brothers. Now, it may be noted that in a realist film, hero is not always easy to identify with and often carries a certain degree of moral ambiguity about him. In other words, to make a protagonist appear as a real person, a realist film must attribute those characteristics on the character which the audience perceive as real. Now, where is all this leading to? Towards Italian Neo-Realism, because what is neo? It must be a revival of interest in realism. So, cinema began perhaps showing certain degree of commitment towards depicting reality, but somewhere along the way fiction overpowered. Okay, something a taste for adventure and romanticism, it took over. So, Italian Neo-Realism was a response to that. So, we need to connect realism with Italian Neo-Realism. Now, major theorists of realism are Rudolf Arnhem, Siegfried Kracauer and André Bazin. Now, Bazin in his What is Cinema says, photography does not create eternity as art does. It embalms time, rescuing it simply from its proper corruption. Here he implies that photography has a historical purpose in capturing a view of the world forever. This kind of filmmaking is associated with the kinds of films that were made in France in the 30s, particularly by directors such as Jean Renoir. And while talking about Renoir, I would suggest that you watch his film called The Rules of the Game. Okay, so this is one film. Due to copyright acts, we may not be able to show you actual clippings from films, but what I would suggest is that you keep watching these films, and I would be discussing these films and referring to these films, particularly certain scenes from these films quite often. So, these films with their focus on stories about the masses and kinds of hardships common people faced, they were all about that. Renoir's use of the long take also helped in his brand of cinema, which resulted in helping the audience to navigate their way around the frame rather than getting manipulated by editing techniques. Now, very close, I am making a jump now from the early kind of realistic cinema and something more recent, something more. So, 1895 we had one revolution called the invention of cinema and the first ever film, and then in 100 years from then we were in 1995 where people like Lars von Trier established something called the dogma movement. So, dogma movement, dogma 95 as it is called, it was established in 95 in Denmark by Lars von Trier and Thomas Winterberg. It sets out the aims in a manifesto which is referred to as a vow of chastity. Dogma focused on form and not on form and content. The idea is to tell stories in bare and basic form and expose the artificial nature of filmic storytelling. With respect to content, most dogma films deal with the bleaker aspects of life. Some of the dogma principles are shooting on location and using no props. Sound must not be produced, it should be as true to life as possible. Camera must be handheld, and you may recall that these are the features of the French New Wave also. They also talked about using or shooting films in color with no special lights, and also avoid using optical work and filters. They shunned melodrama and also shunned spatial temporal alienation. The idea is that film should be about here and now. Genres are unacceptable to the dogmas, to the principles of dogma, and format should be 35 mm, and most interestingly, the director must not be credited. You can relate this to the theory of authorism. Now, there is another concept called cinema verite, which is literally truthful cinema. Cinema verite films are usually shot with light, easily portable, inexpensive equipment, handheld cameras on actual locations with real people and not professional actors, and on a relatively small budget. The films are usually shot without a script and assembled later in editing. So, these are the principles. This is how cinema verite is generally understood, and there is a film called Cinema Verite 2011. I would suggest that you please watch it. While talking about realism, there is also a concept of social realism, especially Soviet social realism, which is at the center of social realist cinema, and it fully recognizes the ideological potential of cinema. For example, the works of Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, and these works are the most important films in this category. However, this kind of cinema with strong ideological overtones has been embraced in other countries also. For example, our own brand of social realist cinema, for example, I would say, Saeed Mirza's Albert Pinto Ko Gussa Kyun Aata Hai. It was a 1981 film starring Nasiruddin Shah and Shabana Azmi. So, it comes quite close to social realism, and several other films of the so-called parallel cinema movement in India. There is another film called Manthan, a Shyam Benegal movie. Okay, that also I would recommend, if you are not already familiar with that, you please watch it as an exemplar of social realistic cinema. We have another brand of realism, kitchen sink realism, which is a part of British New Wave cinema. It is particularly related to the literary movement of the 50s in Britain. An important characteristic is plots based on youth, the young people using their dialect, their attitudes, their angst, their anxieties. The idea was to explore social and political issues through a new kind of cinema, and some of the great films of this period, most of them are based on works of literature, theatre and novels. So, Look Back in Anger, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, A Taste of Honey, etc. Now, from here we move on to our discussion of Italian Neo-Realism. So, a brief background of Italian cinema. In 1905, the first Italian studios were established. They were owned by two of the largest production companies, Cines and Italia, both of which made successful period films, costume dramas, some of which were The Last Day of Pompeii, The Fall of Troy and Cabiria. Now, Cabiria is a story of a slave girl which took 6 months to shoot the film, in studios and also partly and partially on location. It contains technical innovations such as dolly and crane shots, and its success in America inspired people such as D.W. Griffith and Cecil DeMille to launch big budget productions. The First World War and competition from the US film industry put an end to the large scale Italian productions. Ironically, it was the fascist regime under Mussolini that revived Italian cinema. Mussolini, unlike Hitler or Stalin, did not aim at total control over the content or style of the Italian commercial cinema. For propaganda reasons, Mussolini preferred documentary films and newsreels produced by an agency called LUCE. The fascist regime viewed Hollywood as its model and saw cinema more as a vehicle of entertainment rather than propaganda. So, you can compare this with Hitler and the entire propagandist machinery that he was associated with. You know, there was a film called The Triumph of Will, which was made in order to project Hitler in a very positive light, but Mussolini more or less refrained from this. So, he was more interested in cinema as a form of entertainment, an artistic form rather than propagandist form. In the 30s, Italian cinema was dominated by the so-called white telephone films, and these films are about the upper class, the aristocrats, the wealthy people of society. In 1935, the fascist regime founded a major film school, the Centro Sperimentale di Cinematografia. In 1937, Mussolini inaugurated a film complex, Cinecittà, and then a journal called Cinema was launched during this period. In 1942, Alessandro Blessetti made Four Steps in the Cloud, which is a film that anticipated Neo-Realism by using humble characters and ordinary background. And then there was the Siege of Alcazar by Augusto Genina, which celebrates the defense of the fortress in the Toledo region during the Spanish Civil War by General Franco's fascists. It is in the style of a fictional documentary. The fictional documentary style generally meant adding a love story to adventure or war stories, and this kind of hybrid plot became a typical part of post-war neorealist cinema. The most significant documentaries shot from the Italian armed forces were Men on the Bottom by Francesco di Robertis and many fictional documentaries by the great Roberto Rossellini. Now, one of the key names of this period is Leo Longanesi. Now, Leo Longanesi was a journalist and a staunch supporter of Mussolini. He gave the motto, "Mussolini is always right," and he advocated extremely simple, realistic films without elaborate sets. With the fall of Mussolini and the end of the war, international audiences were suddenly introduced to Italian films, especially the works of Rossellini, Da Sica and Visconti. Italian directors by this period combined the desire for cinematic realism with social, political or economic themes that would not have worked under the fascist regime. Now, Neo-Realism cinema generally refers to the films of working class people and it often depicts their abysmal poverty. The peak period was the 40s and the 50s. This movement tapped into a particular transition in Italian life and became a vehicle for filmmakers interested in vivid description of history and society. The underlying message is that in a just society, their wealth and means of wealth would be more evenly distributed. Often these films would be based on true incidents and they often use newsreel footage. They were shot on actual locations and used non-professional actors. The plot and the characters were used as a vehicle for ideas, and there was an emphasis on source sounds and avoidance of heavy musical scores. In the late 1940s, Neo-Realism's influence spread to Hollywood. People started using actual locations, and city was used as an important character, and long takes were used to bring about a touch of reality. Again, think of our own Satyajit Ray and his brand of cinema, and also directors in Germany, Spain and Eastern Europe too were influenced by the Italian Neo-Realist movement. The first Italian Neo-Realist film was Obsessio, directed by Luchino Visconti. It was based on American pulp writer James M. Kent's The Postman Always Rings Twice. Again, some major Italian neorealists were Roberto Rossellini. He was named the father of modern film by Cahiers du Cinema, the influential French film journal. Along with Jean Renoir, he was the most influential name among the Nouvelle Vague filmmakers. The Nouvelle Vague filmmakers from France, they held him in high regards. Rossellini's first three films are The White Ship, A Pilot Returns and The Man with the Cross. However, it was with Open City Rome that he broke into this movement called Italian neorealism and came to be associated with this movement. The film weaves together a variety of stories of Romans during the occupation of Italy by the German forces. It is shot on locations with non-professional actors using long white takes. Rossellini's next film, Paisa, contains 6 vignettes from the liberation of Italy, a chronicle of 1943 to 1946, and it was followed by Germany Year Zero, which is a devastating tale of defeat and solitude. And in one of the series, in one of the scenes, a recording of a Hitler speech echoes over the devastated landscape. Together, these films provide us with great commentary on the then contemporary social issues at a time of political movements of global importance. Rossellini famously said, "I am not a pessimist. To perceive evil where it exists is, in my opinion, a form of optimism." After a spate of neorealist films, he made several films with Ingrid Bergman, the Hollywood actress whom he later married, and also made several documentaries on and about Italy during this phase. Another important filmmaker of this period is Vittorio De Sica, who grew up in a lower middle class district of Naples and joined the stage. He began his career as a leading man in light-hearted romantic films, but soon took to direction, and his Shoe Shine is scripted by the neorealist theorist Cesare Zavattini, is an account of the shoeshine boys of the post-war Italy and the abject poverty these children lived in. The Bicycle Thief is commonly regarded as the film that heralded Italian neorealism in a real big way, in a major way. I would recommend that you watch A Bicycle Thief, and perhaps we would discuss that as part of our course on film appreciation, which the film is a characteristic of the Italian neorealism with its use of non-professional actors and shooting on actual Roman locations. Its influence can be felt on Satyajit Ray's Pather Panchali and films as recent as Children of Heaven 1999 from Iran. Other Italian masters include Federico Fellini, whose early work reflects a preoccupation with human weakness and also an interest in illusion and loneliness. In La Strada, which is a 1954 film and it won him international recognition, Fellini unfolds a tale of travelling circus, a recurring motif, a recurring milieu in his works. La Dolce Vita is an eloquent statement on life and its excesses and the role of so-called paparazzi in the modern times. This is a film where the exploit center on the plot centers on the exploits of a gossip journalist, and this is one of the key films. This is one of the first times that the term paparazzi was used. Fellini's next major film was 8½, which is a semi-autobiographical account of an artist's creative process. The film traces a film director, partially based on Fellini himself, and the plot is that with a new project set to start and no script, the filmmaker has come to a dead end, and the director, the fictional director, plumbs the memories of his childhood and his hidden desires for inspiration. One of the famous lines go as, "I have nothing to say, but I want to say it." Most of Fellini's films are autobiographical, quite personal in nature. They are influenced by his life, his dreams, and also his love for performative arts. And then we move on to another influential filmmaker, Michelangelo Antonioni. Antonioni began his professional life as a critic and was fired by Mussolini's regime for his leftist views. Before turning into an independent director, he contributed to the screenplay of Rossellini's A Pilot Returns. His early films, such as Chronicle of a Love Affair, which is influenced by Visconti's Obsession, and The Cry, showed the influence of Neo-Realism and established his aesthetics of alienation. His other major films include La Ventura, Blow Up, L'Achilles, and Zabriskie Point. Blow Up is particularly important, which is Antonioni's view of the world of modern fashion, and it is also a provocative murder mystery that examines the existential nature of reality interpreted through photography. Interestingly, it was set in the mid-1960s London, and which is a locale which was fairly unfamiliar to the director. An important thing about Blow Up is how it influenced the Hollywood filmmakers, and one of the key films that inspired filmmakers of that period to experiment more with cinema. And so, moving on with Italian neorealist directors, another major name is Pier Paolo Pasolini, who is widely respected as a poet, novelist, and director. He is one of the most controversial and ambitious filmmakers. His writings were scandalous and iconoclastic, and he celebrates the low lives of the Italian society, such as hustlers, pimps, thieves, etc. His one major film, he has made a handful of great films, but a major film is the Gospel According to Matthew, which was filmed in the district of Basilicata and its capital Matera. It was shot in a neorealistic style without a screenplay, and Pasolini's interpretation of Christ was done by a non-professional Spanish student, and Mary at the time of crucifixion is Pasolini's own mother, and the director uses minimal sets and simple cameras to capture the story. His depiction of Jesus is more along the lines of a messiah of the countercultural times and an angry young man. Much of the dialogues in the film are in a debating style where a question is answered with a question or a parable. So, Italian cinema, the other great names are Bernardo Bertolucci, the director of Last Tango in Paris, The Last Emperor, Little Buddha, and so on. And recent Italian film cinema continues to enthrall the audience all over. For example, Il Postino, Life is Beautiful, and Cinema Paradiso. So, we continue with our lectures on traditions in world cinema in our next classes. Thank you very much.